A storm was brewing over the Cotswolds that morning, not in the sky, but inside Hawthorne House. Beneath the hush of polished floors and silk curtains, a young woman's fate was being sealed with ink and betrayal. Millicent Hawthorne, accused of a sin she did not commit, was about to be sold as punishment to a man feared by all, the cruel Marquis of Thornley. But what happens when punishment turns into passion, and the heart refuses to obey the chains of pride? If you love dramatic period romances filled with secrets, forbidden love, and redemption, subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 hearts in this growing community of romance lovers. Your support keeps these timeless stories alive. Cotswolds, England, year 1814. The morning began with a softness that betrayed nothing of the cruelty about to unfold. A pale sun filtered through the misty fields of the Cotswolds, casting gentle light over stone cottages and twisting lanes. Yet inside Hawthorne House, the air felt sharpened, as if every breath carried the taste of dread. Millicent Hawthorne stood near the narrow window of her room, her fingers resting on the small brooch that had once belonged to her mother. Its delicate carving, warm against her palm, had been her only source of comfort since childhood. She pressed it now as if it could speak for her, for no one else would. Downstairs, her stepmother's voice echoed in cool, clipped syllables that cut through the stillness. "Millicent," Mrs. Hawthorne called, "come at once." Millicent drew in a quiet breath, smoothing the folds of her simple dove-grey muslin gown. She had worn this dress countless times, but today it felt tighter at the seams, as if it too resisted what awaited her. When she descended the staircase, the lamplight revealed her pale complexion, her soft grey-blue eyes wide with uncertainty. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to shrinking into silence. Mrs. Hawthorne stood in the parlour, gloved hands folded, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Two neighbours, women who live for gossip, watched hungrily from their seats, their gazes darting between Millicent and her stepmother. Mrs. Hawthorne lifted a letter with a theatrical sigh. "It grieves me," she declared, "to face such disgrace within my own household." Millicent lowered her eyes, though her heart pounded fiercely. She already knew this performance. She had lived under its shadow for years. "What disgrace, stepmother?" she asked softly, though dread uncoiled in her stomach. "The missing funds," Mrs. Hawthorne replied, her voice wrapped in false sorrow. "They point unmistakably to you." Millicent's breath caught. "I have taken nothing. You know this." "Oh, child," Mrs. Hawthorne murmured, "denial only deepens the shame." Millicent lifted her gaze, meeting the other woman's eyes. "I have told you the truth." Mrs. Hawthorne stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "Truth? Your truth holds little weight. The village already whispers." The two neighbours exchanged delighted glances, as if savouring a feast. Millicent felt her knees weaken, but she straightened her shoulders. Silence had been her shield for too long. "What would you have me do?" she whispered. Mrs. Hawthorne smiled, thin and satisfied. "You will accept your punishment." The word echoed through Millicent's chest like cold water. "A marriage has been arranged for you," her stepmother continued. "A union that will salvage what remains of this family's name." Millicent felt the world tilt, her breath catching painfully. "A marriage? To whom?" "To the Marquis of Thornley," Mrs. Hawthorne said, savouring each syllable. "Lord Victor Ashcombe." The neighbours gasped. Thornley Manor sat beyond the hills, imposing and distant, home to a man whose name carried rumours like storm clouds. Stories of his cold authority, his tragic past, his fierce temper. A man whispered to be as unyielding as the stone cliffs of Cornwall, though he lived here among Cotswold fields. Millicent shook her head, voice trembling. "I do not know him. I cannot—" "You will," Mrs. Hawthorne snapped. "His offer settles the family's debts. It is done." "Offer?" Millicent repeated, horror blooming slowly. "I was sold." Mrs. Hawthorne's lips curled. "Do not dramatize." Many women would envy such a match. A Marquis, Millicent, a title far above anything your birth could ever bring. Tears threatened, but Millicent held them back with painful dignity. "I beg you," she whispered, "do not send me away like this." Mrs. Hawthorne leaned in, her words sharp and intimate. "You have always been a burden. Now, at last, you can be of use." A sound escaped Millicent, not a sob, but something quieter, as if her spirit had cracked in two. By afternoon, preparations were already underway. A carriage waited outside, horses stamping impatiently, while Mrs. Hawthorne oversaw Millicent's few belongings being packed with brisk efficiency. The village gathered near the gate, drawn by the scent of scandal. Some offered pitying looks. Others did not bother hiding their curiosity. Millicent walked slowly toward the carriage, clutching her mother's brooch as if it were her last breath of home. When she reached the steps, the vicar's wife approached gently. "My dear," she murmured, "you are stronger than they know." Millicent forced a small nod, though her throat ached too tightly for words. Mrs. Hawthorne gave a final command. "Do not disgrace us further. Obey your husband when you arrive." Millicent turned to her, a spark of defiance flickering at last. "I will obey what is right," she said quietly. For the first time, Mrs. Hawthorne's expression faltered. Millicent climbed into the carriage, settling into the worn velvet seat as the door closed behind her. The scent of dust and leather filled the space. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of a future she had not chosen. The coachman snapped the reins, and the wheels groaned into motion. The village blurred beyond the window, cottages fading into mist. The hills stretched before her, soft, green, eternal, bearing witness to a young woman being cast into the unknown. Millicent pressed the brooch to her heart. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, "let there be mercy beyond those gates." As the carriage turned toward Thornley Manor, the wind rushed over the fields, carrying with it a name she dared not speak aloud. Victor Ashcombe. The man who would become her husband before nightfall. The man rumour claimed had no heart left to give. Millicent closed her eyes, unprepared for the truth that would change both their lives forever. The sky had darkened by the time Millicent's carriage reached the iron gates of Thornley Manor. Rain had begun to fall softly, weaving silver threads through the dusk. She leaned forward, breath fogging the window as the massive gates swung open, revealing a long drive flanked by towering oaks. The trees seemed ancient, their bare branches stretching like solemn witnesses to the lives that had passed beneath them. Her heart thudded quietly, though her face remained calm. The journey had been long, the silence unbearable, and the thought of what awaited her made her pulse tremble in her throat. Thornley Manor appeared through the mist, a grand structure of grey stone with high chimneys and shuttered windows glowing faintly with candlelight. It was not the cruel fortress the villagers imagined, but neither was it warm. Its grandeur carried weight, a gravity that pressed against her chest as the carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. "My lady," he said respectfully, bowing slightly. She hesitated. "My lady." The words felt foreign, almost mocking. She stepped down carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the damp gravel. The rain had turned to a fine mist, clinging to her lashes and hair. Before her the great door opened. A tall man stood in the threshold, framed by the soft light of the entrance hall. He did not move at once, nor did he speak. His presence alone filled the space, commanding but not loud. He was dressed in black, a perfectly cut coat, high collar, white cravat, and dark waistcoat. His hair, the colour of chestnut wood, was neatly combed, and his expression was unreadable. Millicent felt the chill of the night more keenly as his eyes met hers. They were a shade of grey, unlike any she had seen, clear, sharp, and distant, like winter water that hides its depth. He inclined his head slightly. "Lady Thornley," he said, his voice low and controlled. The title startled her. For a heartbeat, she forgot how to breathe. "You are Lord Thornley," she managed softly. "I am." He studied her face, not cruelly, but with a kind of solemn curiosity. "You have had a long journey." "Yes, my lord." Her hands trembled, and she clasped them together to hide it. "Come inside, you must be cold." The warmth of the hall enveloped her as she crossed the threshold. A fire burned in a stone hearth at the far end, and its golden light flickered across portraits and polished wood. Servants waited quietly, heads bowed, as if the air itself demanded silence. The smell of beeswax and wood smoke filled the space, mingling with the faint scent of damp roses carried in by the wind. Victor Ashcombe, Marquis of Thornley, dismissed the servants with a brief nod. "You may all retire for the night." When the last footstep faded, Millicent stood alone with him in the great hall. Her heart raced. He was not the monster she had imagined, yet there was something in his restraint that made her uneasy. "You need not fear me," he said after a moment, his tone even, as though reading her thoughts. "I'm not afraid, my lord," she replied quietly. One corner of his mouth lifted in something like irony. "You should be, if I were what they say I am." Her gaze rose to meet his. "And what do they say, my lord?" "That I am heartless," he said simply. His honesty startled her. There was no arrogance in his tone, only fatigue, as if he had long stopped defending himself from gossip. "I do not believe everything I hear," she said gently. "Wise," he murmured, studying her as though she were a puzzle he had not yet decided how to solve. "You must be weary. I have arranged chambers for you in the east wing. You will find them comfortable." Millicent hesitated. "You are very kind." He turned away slightly, his profile sharp against the firelight. "Kindness is too often mistaken for pity. I offer neither. You will have respect, Lady Thornley, and freedom within my home. Nothing more is expected of you." His words were precise, deliberate. Yet beneath them she sensed something else, a wound disguised as discipline. "Thank you, my lord," she said softly. He looked at her again, and this time his eyes softened only slightly. "You are trembling. Sit by the fire a moment before you retire." Millicent obeyed, moving toward the hearth. The flames cast warm light on her face, turning her damp hair to bronze. Her dress, a modest muslin gown, damp from rain, clung lightly to her arms. She extended her hands toward the fire, trying to steady her breathing. Victor remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. The silence between them was not empty. It was charged, delicate, like the space before thunder. "Was it your choice to come here?" he asked at last. Millicent turned slowly toward him. "No, my lord. It was decided for me." He nodded once. "I suspected as much." I am sorry if my presence brings you inconvenience," she added, her voice faltering. "An inconvenience?" His tone was unreadable. "No, though I imagine it must feel that way for you." She swallowed. "I was told I was to be your wife, yet we have never spoken until this moment." "Nor did I request this marriage," he said quietly. "But it is done. I will honor it, as duty demands." Duty. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. "I understand," she whispered. His gaze drifted toward the fire, the light reflecting in the silver of his eyes. "You will find I keep to myself. The household runs smoothly without interference. You may spend your time as you wish, provided you are discreet. If there is anything you require, you may speak to Mrs. Larkin. She is trustworthy." Millicent lowered her head. "And you, my lord, may I speak to you?" The question caught him off guard. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a brief moment something human, fragile, passed across his expression. "If you must," he said after a pause, his voice softer now. "But I am not an easy man to speak to." "I do not seek ease," she said quietly. "Only honesty." His breath caught. For the first time that evening, he truly looked at her, not as an obligation delivered to his door, but as a woman standing in quiet defiance of fear. "You remind me," he murmured, "that honesty can be disarming." Millicent met his gaze steadily, though her pulse raced. "Then I shall consider that my only weapon, my lord." He studied her another moment before stepping back. "You will need rest. Mrs. Larkin will escort you to your rooms." As if summoned by his words, the older woman appeared at the doorway. She curtsied deeply. "My lady, this way, if you please." Millicent rose, curtsying lightly toward the Marquis. "Good night, my lord." Victor inclined his head. "Good night, Lady Thornley." Her footsteps faded into the corridor, and Victor remained alone by the fire. He stared into the flames, his jaw set, though his thoughts refused to stay still. The young woman who had entered his house under the shadow of scandal carried herself with quiet grace that unsettled him. She did not plead, did not weep, did not bow her head in false submission. And yet, beneath her calm, he had seen the unmistakable mark of sorrow. When Mrs. Larkin returned moments later, Victor spoke without looking up. "See that she is well attended." "She is frightened, my lord," the housekeeper replied gently. "She has reason to be." Mrs. Larkin hesitated. "And you, sir?" Victor's eyes remained fixed on the fire. "I have not felt fear in many years." Upstairs, Millicent entered a spacious chamber that seemed both elegant and lonely. The fire in the grate burned low, throwing golden light across the embroidered curtains and carved furniture. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, already unpacked. Someone had placed a vase of fresh roses on the mantel, their fragrance delicate but bittersweet. "Would you like me to stay while you settle, my lady?" Mrs. Larkin asked kindly. "No, thank you," Millicent said softly. "You have been most kind." The housekeeper nodded, then paused at the door. "He is not as cold as he appears." Millicent turned slightly. "You speak of Lord Thornley." "Aye. The house has been too quiet for too long. Perhaps it needs a voice again." When she was alone, Millicent sat at the dressing table, gazing at her reflection in the polished mirror. The flicker of candlelight softened her features, but her eyes, those wide, uncertain eyes, betrayed the weight she carried. She removed her bonnet slowly, letting her dark hair fall loose. For the first time that day, she allowed a single tear to slip down her cheek. She rose and walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The world outside was bathed in silver moonlight, the gardens shimmering like glass. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint sound of a clock striking 11. Down below, on the terrace, Victor stood alone beneath the night sky. She could see him through the curtain, a dark figure outlined by the pale glow of the moon. He looked upward for a moment, as though he sensed her watching. Their eyes met across the distance, silent and motionless. No words, no gestures, only a long, steady gaze that seemed to bridge the space between two strangers bound by fate. Millicent stepped back from the window, heart pounding. She felt the warmth rise to her cheeks, a strange mix of fear and longing she could not name. "Who are you, my lord?" she whispered into the stillness. "And what will become of me in your world?" The question lingered in the air long after the candles had been extinguished. And downstairs, in the great hall, Victor Ashcombe stood before the dying fire, whispering to no one but the shadows. She does not know what she has brought into this house. Outside, the rain began again, soft, persistent, and full of secrets yet to be revealed. Morning sunlight crept slowly across the high windows of Thornley Manor, painting the walls in gold. The first true day of Millicent's life as Marchioness began in silence. She stood by the hearth of her chamber, watching the fire burn low, its embers glimmering like fading stars. The air carried the faint scent of rosewood and wax, and through the tall windows she could hear the distant call of crows echoing over the hills. Everything around her was foreign. The carved furniture, the heavy drapes, even the softness of the carpet beneath her bare feet. She felt like an imposter in someone else's story. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Larkin entered, curtsying with practiced grace. "Good morning, my lady," she said kindly. "The household breakfast is served in the east parlour. His lordship has requested that you join him." Millicent's hands faltered as she fastened the small clasp of her shawl. "He wishes to dine with me?" "Yes, my lady." The older woman hesitated. "He keeps his habits precise, but perhaps he thought it proper now that—" Mrs. Larkin did not finish. She didn't need to. Millicent's cheeks warmed with unease. "Thank you," Millicent murmured. "I will come at once." When Mrs. Larkin had gone, Millicent took a moment to steady herself. She wore a gown of pale blue muslin, simple but freshly pressed, with a modest neckline trimmed in white lace. Her dark hair was gathered neatly into a coil, with only a few tendrils escaping to soften her face. She studied her reflection briefly in the mirror, trying to find in it the woman others now called Lady Thornley. But the reflection felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. She made her way through the corridors, guided by the faint echo of her own footsteps. The manor was vast, its hallways lined with portraits of past Ashcombs, solemn men, regal women, faces proud and unyielding. It was a house that demanded silence, and she felt it in every breath she took. When she entered the east parlour, Victor was already there, seated at the far end of a long table. Morning light spilled across the room, catching the polished silver and the white porcelain. He rose at once when she appeared. "Lady Thornley," he greeted, his tone polite but distant. "Good morning." "Good morning, my lord." He gestured to the seat beside him, and she sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet clinking of cutlery and the rustle of the fire in the grate. "You slept well, I hope?" he asked at last. "Yes," she said, though in truth she had barely closed her eyes. "The chamber is very comfortable." He nodded. "I trust Mrs. Larkin has attended to your needs. She has been very kind." Another pause. The air between them was delicate, fragile as glass. Victor leaned slightly forward. "I imagine this household feels strange to you." "It does," she admitted. "It feels like a world I do not yet understand." He looked at her then, his grey eyes searching hers. "You will, in time. Thornley keeps its rhythm, and once you find it, you will see it is not so forbidding as it seems." "I hope so." She lowered her gaze to her cup of tea. The faintest smile touched his lips at her soft tone, but it vanished quickly, as if he feared even that small warmth might betray him. After a while, Victor said, "If you wish, Mrs. Larkin can show you the manor and grounds this morning. I believe the gardens may offer some comfort. They are quiet this season, but there is beauty in stillness." "I would like that," Millicent replied softly. "I have always found peace in gardens. They remind me that even in silence things still grow." Her words made him pause. Something in them seemed to touch a place long buried within him. "Yes," he said slowly, "growth requires patience, and the courage to endure what others cannot see." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the air shifted. She felt his gaze not as scrutiny, but as understanding. It made her heart tighten in an unfamiliar way. When breakfast ended, Mrs. Larkin guided Millicent through the manor. The rooms were grand, but they carried an old melancholy, the scent of age in the tapestries, the faded portraits watching from the walls. They passed the library, its tall shelves filled with books whose leather spines glowed in the light. "His lordship spends much of his time here," Mrs. Larkin said softly. "He reads more than he speaks, if I may say so." Millicent smiled faintly. "Then perhaps that is his way of speaking." Later she wandered into the gardens alone. The winter flowers were few, but ivy and evergreen hedges framed the stone pathways. Frost lingered on the edges of the fountains. She trailed her gloved fingers along the rim of a marble basin, watching the sunlight shimmer in the water. For the first time since leaving her old home, she felt something like calm. From behind, she heard the faint crunch of boots on gravel. She turned quickly, her breath catching. Victor stood at the end of the path, hands clasped behind his back. The wind stirred his dark hair, and the light softened the lines of his face. "I did not mean to intrude," he said. "You do not intrude, my lord," she answered quietly. "It is your garden." He walked toward her slowly. "And now yours as well." Millicent lowered her eyes, a delicate flush rising to her cheeks. "That may take time to believe." He stopped a few steps away, his voice gentle but firm. "It is not belief, Lady Thornley. It is fact. What is mine is under your protection now. Her gaze lifted in surprise. My protection? He nodded. This house has long been ruled by solitude. Perhaps it is time for something different. Millicent's heart fluttered. She did not know whether he spoke from affection or from duty, but the sincerity in his voice unsettled her in a way she had not expected. Tell me, he continued, do you read? I do, she said. Not as much as I once did. My stepmother disliked when I read more than I sewed. A shadow crossed his face. Then we shall correct that injustice. The library is at your disposal. Choose what pleases you. Thank you, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. You are most generous. Not generous, he replied. Merely fair. He looked at her then. Not as a Marquis, addressing a wife given to him, but as a man seeing a woman he wished to understand. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Millicent broke the silence first. You are not, as I was told. And how were you told I was? He asked, almost amused. Cruel, she said truthfully, though softly. Cold, a man without heart. His eyes darkened, though not with anger. Rumors often tell more about those who whisper them than about those they describe. Then I am glad to learn the truth for myself. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Truth is rarely simple, Lady Thornley. You may yet find parts of me you do not like. Then let me see them, she said quietly, so that I may understand them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he whispered, You are not what I expected either. The words, so softly spoken, sent a tremor through her chest. That afternoon, Victor invited her to the library. She entered hesitantly, eyes widening at the sight of so many shelves, rows upon rows of leather-bound volumes, the scent of old paper mingling with the warmth of the fire. I thought you might enjoy this, he said, gesturing toward a collection near the window. Poetry, philosophy, history. The world can fit into these walls if one knows how to look. Millicent traced her fingers along the spines. I used to dream of such a room. He watched her, the faintest curve of a smile on his lips. Then it is yours to keep. Their eyes met again, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. It was a moment of quiet communion, fragile and dangerous. The sound of footsteps outside broke it. Mrs. Larkin appeared at the door, holding a folded letter. My lord, the steward requires your signature. Victor nodded. I will come presently. He turned back to Millicent. Will you stay? Read as long as you wish. I will, she said softly. When he left, Millicent opened a small book of poems and read by the fire. The words blurred as she thought of him, the stillness of his voice, the restrained gentleness that seemed to hide behind duty. Later, as the evening deepened, she returned the book to its shelf and turned toward the door. There she found Victor standing silently in the threshold, watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. I did not hear you come in, she said. I did not wish to disturb you, he replied. You looked at peace. I was. He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the air. This house has known little peace. It seems strange to find it here now. She hesitated, her voice almost a whisper. Perhaps peace does not come from the house, my lord, but from those who live in it. His eyes softened. Then perhaps you are exactly what Thornley has needed. Before she could answer, he bowed slightly, the movement formal yet weighted with unspoken emotion. Good evening, Lady Thornley. Good evening, my lord, she murmured. When he was gone, Millicent remained by the fire, her hand pressed to her heart. The warmth of the room seemed to echo the warmth rising within her, an emotion she did not yet dare to name, but one that would not be silenced. Outside, the night descended upon the Cotswold hills, calm and still, while inside Thornley Manor, two hearts, wounded by past and fate, had begun to stir in quiet, hesitant harmony. The wind carried the scent of damp earth through Thornley Manor, whispering against the tall windows as if trying to enter. Outside, the skies were the colour of pewter, and rain clouds gathered over the hills. Inside, a hush had settled over the corridors, broken only by the ticking of the great clock in the entrance hall and the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot. Millicent moved quietly through the house that morning, her footsteps soft upon the polished floors. Though she had been in Thornley for only a few days, she had begun to notice the rhythm of its life, the steady pulse of order, the silence of rooms that seemed to hold memories of those who had lived and vanished. Each door led to a story, each portrait a trace of pride and loss. Her curiosity had begun to stir, a gentle, cautious flame. Thornley was a place of beauty, but also of secrets, and she had learned that beauty often concealed sorrow. While walking through one of the upper corridors, Millicent came upon a door slightly ajar. The hinges groaned softly when she touched it. Dust motes floated in the air, glimmering in the muted light. Inside, the room appeared forgotten. A grand chamber, its furniture covered by pale sheets, its windows shuttered. An air of melancholy lingered, heavy and still. She stepped inside slowly, brushing her fingers along the edge of a covered table. The faint scent of lavender lingered, old, faded, but unmistakably feminine. On the mantel stood a cracked porcelain vase, and beside it, a single withered rose, its petals curled into silence. Millicent felt an ache she could not name. She sensed this was no ordinary room. It had been cherished once, perhaps even loved. "What are you doing here?" The voice came from behind her, deep and steady, and though quiet, it startled her so much that she turned at once. Victor stood at the threshold, the faintest edge of surprise in his usually composed expression. His dark coat was unbuttoned, his cravat slightly loosened, as if he had walked far without intending to stop. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quickly, her voice trembling. The door was open. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. It should not have been. Millicent clasped her hands before her, uncertain. "I will go, my lord." "No," he said after a pause, softer now. "Stay." She hesitated, unsure if he meant it, but something in his tone, low, weary, sincere, kept her rooted to the spot. Victor walked past her toward the window, his gloved hand brushing the edge of the dusty drapery. "No one has entered this room in years," he murmured. "It belonged to someone I once knew." Millicent's voice was quiet. "Someone you cared for." He nodded once, still facing the window. "Yes." The wind outside rattled the panes, filling the silence that followed. After a long moment, Victor turned toward her. His eyes, grey as stormlight, held no anger, only memory. "Her name was Eleanor. We were to be married." Millicent lowered her gaze, feeling a strange twist of emotion. "I am sorry." "There is no need for sorrow," he said quietly. "It was long ago, but Thornley remembers." He gestured around the room. "I suppose I left it untouched out of respect, or perhaps out of weakness." "Not weakness," she said gently. "Remembrance is not weakness." He looked at her as if she had spoken a truth he had never dared to consider. "You believe that?" "I do. To remember is to love what was good, even if it is gone." Victor's expression softened, a faint shadow of pain crossing his face. "Eleanor was not kind in the end. She left when it mattered most. There was a scandal, a letter revealed, a false accusation. I protected her, though she betrayed me. The cost was my reputation, my peace, and the trust I once had in affection." Millicent took a hesitant step forward. "And yet you still kept her room untouched." He exhaled slowly. "Perhaps to remind myself that affection is a dangerous thing." Millicent felt her heart tighten. "Do you truly believe that, my lord?" His eyes met hers, unwavering. "I have lived by it." "Then you have lived half a life," she said softly. The words hung between them like a delicate thread. Victor's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "You speak boldly for one who knows so little of me." "I know enough," she replied, her voice trembling but steady. "You have built walls so high that even kindness cannot reach you, and yet I think you wish it could." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You think me lonely." "I think you are human," she said, "and that frightens you." A silence settled, a silence that was not hostile, but charged with something fragile and raw. Victor turned back toward the window, his shoulders tense. "You are very perceptive, Lady Thornley. That can be dangerous." "I have already lived with danger," she replied, her tone low. "Truth does not frighten me anymore." Victor let out a breath that was almost a sigh. "I see now why my housekeeper likes you. You speak gently, but carry the force of conviction." She smiled faintly. "I do not mean to offend you." "You do not," he said. "It has been a long time since anyone dared to speak to me honestly." The tension in the room softened, though emotions still hummed beneath it. Victor crossed the space between them, stopping only a few steps away. Millicent could feel his nearness, the quiet strength he carried, the warmth that seemed to reach her without touch. "I will have the door to this room locked," he said at last, his voice quiet. "It should remain a memory, not a burden." "Dee, would you like me to send for someone to clean it first?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, let it rest." As he turned to leave, Millicent spoke without thinking. "My lord, do you regret loving her?" He stopped at the door, his back still to her. The pause was long, heavy with thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest. "I regret that I did not know love better, that I mistook possession for devotion, that I trusted without understanding." When he looked back at her, his expression was stripped of every mask. "I do not regret feeling, only what it cost me." Millicent nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "Then you have not lost everything. If you still feel, even in pain, then something remains." Victor's gaze lingered on her face, her calm strength, her quiet defiance, and for the first time she saw warmth in his eyes. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known. Today, perhaps that is why I was sent here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something that might have been longing, quickly hidden. Perhaps. He left the room then, closing the door gently behind him. Millicent remained alone among the ghosts of the past. She stood for a long while, her fingers tracing the dust-covered mantle. She thought of Eleanor, the woman who had once been loved by the man now haunted by silence, and wondered what kind of love could wound so deeply that even years later it cast shadows over every word spoken. That afternoon, the rain began to fall. Thornley seemed to sigh with relief as the heavens opened, cleansing the air. Millicent sat in the library, a book open before her, though her thoughts drifted. She sensed movement at the doorway and looked up, to find Victor watching her. "I did not expect you to be here," he said. "I find comfort in this room," she replied. "It feels alive." He entered quietly, standing near the shelves. "It was my father's favorite place. I rarely came here after his death, but lately—" He stopped, his gaze on her. "Lately it feels less empty." Millicent's breath caught at his words. "Then I am glad to share it." He studied her for a moment. "You have a gift, Lady Thornley. You bring calm to things that have long been restless." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps the house simply needed a woman's hand again." "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested he meant something more. A brief silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Victor moved closer, drawn by something neither could name. "Do you know," he said quietly, "that in all my years, I have never spoken of her to anyone?" Millicent looked up at him. "And yet you did today." "Yes," he admitted, "and I cannot explain why." Her heart pounded softly, maybe because someone finally listened without judgment. He nodded slowly, as if her words settled something deep within him. "You have a way of making truth sound gentle." She met his gaze, her voice trembling. "And you have a way of making gentleness feel dangerous." A faint smile touched his lips, fleeting but real. "Then we are equally at risk." Their eyes held for a long, suspended moment. The air seemed to pulse between them, unspoken understanding, unacknowledged longing, the fragile beginning of trust. When Victor finally stepped back, his voice was low. "You should know, Lady Thornley, I am not a kind man, But I am not cruel either. I simply forgot what kindness felt like. Then let me remind you, she said, the softness in her tone wrapping around his heart like silk. He looked at her a moment longer before bowing his head. Careful, Millicent, he murmured. You might succeed. She smiled, though tears burned faintly behind her eyes. That is my intention, my lord. That night, as rain pattered gently against the windows, Victor stood once more in the forgotten room. He looked at the faded rose on the mantel and thought of the young woman whose courage had awakened something he believed dead. Down the hall, Millicent sat by her window, watching the rain. She thought of his eyes, how they held both storm and stillness, and of the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. Two hearts, each marked by pain, had begun, without knowing, to heal in the same silence that once kept them apart. The morning mist hung low over the Cotswold fields, softening the edges of the world. Thornley Manor still slept, wrapped in quiet grey light, though inside its walls something restless stirred. Millicent had spent much of the night awake, her thoughts circling endlessly, her heart pulled between gratitude and confusion. Since her conversation with Victor in the abandoned chamber, something had changed between them, something delicate and invisible, like a thread woven in silence. He had let her glimpse the sorrow he carried, and though his manner remained disciplined, there was now a warmth in the way he looked at her, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had become part of his solitude. That morning, she dressed with unusual care. Her gown was of pale ivory, simple but finely made, with soft lace along the sleeves. She braided her dark hair loosely, leaving a few strands to frame her face. When she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself, not because of vanity, but because there was a new light in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or something dangerously close to it. As she descended the staircase, she found Victor already waiting in the hall, speaking with his steward. The light from the high windows caught his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet strength in his posture. When he turned and saw her, his conversation paused mid-sentence. "My lady," he said, his tone polite but softer than usual, "you are up early." "I wished to walk before the rain returns," she replied. The morning seemed too beautiful to waste indoors. His mouth curved faintly, a rare hint of amusement. "I had the same thought. Perhaps we might walk together." Millicent hesitated, startled by the invitation. "If it pleases you, my lord." "It would," he said simply. They walked through the gardens, the sound of their steps blending with the gentle rustle of wet leaves. The air smelled of earth and jasmine, and from the distant fields came the faint bleating of sheep. Millicent carried a small parasol, though the sky threatened no immediate rain. Victor walked beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze thoughtful. "It is strange," he said after a long silence, "how silence can be both comfort and prison." She looked at him. "You speak of yourself." He nodded slightly. "Perhaps I do. For years I have kept the world at a distance, believing it would protect me. Yet solitude is a poor shield. It dulls the wound, but never heals it." Millicent's voice softened. "And now?" He turned his head toward her. "Now I find myself less certain. You have disturbed the quiet I once believed sacred." She felt her pulse quicken. "I did not mean to disturb anything, my lord." "I know," he said. "That is why it happened." Their eyes met, and neither looked away. The tension that lived between them, gentle yet electric, seemed to hum in the air. For a moment she forgot the coldness of their beginning, forgot the cruelty of how she had come here. All she saw was a man stripped of arrogance, a man who looked at her as though seeing sunlight for the first time. When they returned to the manor, the steward approached Victor with a folded letter sealed in dark wax. Victor took it, reading the contents quickly. His expression changed, just slightly, but enough for Millicent to notice the shadow that crossed his face. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He folded the letter carefully. "Nothing that need trouble you." But she knew better. His voice had taken on that measured calm he used to hide what he felt. Before she could ask further, he offered a polite bow and disappeared into his study. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy quiet. Millicent tried to read, but her mind drifted toward him. The image of his expression, controlled yet troubled, would not leave her. At last, unable to resist, she made her way toward the study. The door was closed, but she heard voices beyond it. One belonged to Victor. The other was unfamiliar, sharp, and self-assured. "You cannot avoid it forever," the visitor said. "The matter must be settled." Victor's reply came low and steady. "I will not be threatened in my own house, Mr. Caro." "Then pay what is owed. You know the condition of your late father's accounts. The estate may appear secure, but the debts are mine to bear," Victor interrupted, "not the concern of vultures who feed on misfortune." There was a pause. Then the other man's voice lowered to a venomous whisper. "Be careful, my lord. Scandal travels fast, and there are those eager to remind society of your past." The sound of the door opening sent Millicent stepping back into the shadows. The stranger, a tall man in a dark riding coat, brushed past her without so much as a glance. When he was gone, she looked toward the half-open door. "Come in," Victor said quietly, his voice weary but not surprised. She obeyed, closing the door behind her. "Forgive me. I did not mean to listen." "I imagine you heard enough," he said, managing a faint smile. "Mr. Caro is a man who mistakes threats for diplomacy. Does he mean harm to you?" "To me, no. To my peace of mind, perhaps." He leaned against the desk, his hands braced on the edge. "He seeks repayment for debts tied to the estate, debts my father left unresolved." Millicent frowned. "Surely that can be managed." "In time, yes, but men like Caro care little for time. They trade in fear." Her heart ached at the strain in his voice. "I wish there were something I could do." His gaze lifted to her, and for a moment the controlled composure he wore like armor faltered. "You do more than you know," he said softly. "Since you came here, the weight I carry feels less." She took a cautious step closer. "You have borne it alone for too long." "I am used to it." "Then perhaps it is time you were not." Her words hung in the air, trembling between them. Victor's eyes darkened, his breath deepening. He looked at her as though torn between reason and desire. Not a carnal hunger, but something far more dangerous, the longing to be understood. "Millicent," he said quietly, her name spoken as if it were both question and confession. She froze at the sound of it. He had never spoken her name before, not as a title, not as a formality, but as something intimate. "Yes, my lord." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them until only a breath separated them. "You have changed this house," he murmured. "You have changed me." Her heart pounded. "Then let that be for the better." "It is," he said, "but it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I swore I would never care again." His voice broke slightly on the last word, the pain in it raw and unguarded. Millicent's hand trembled as she reached for him, then hesitated. "Sometimes," she whispered, "we do not choose what heals us." He looked down at her, his eyes tracing her face as though memorizing every line. Slowly he raised a hand, his fingertips brushing against a loose strand of her hair. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a shiver through her, an emotion too deep for words. "You should not be kind to me," he said softly. "It makes me forget who I am." "Then forget," she breathed, "for a moment." Their gazes locked, and for the first time, he did not pull away. His hand lingered, resting gently at her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. It was not a kiss, not yet, only the quiet ache of two hearts standing too close to silence. Then, as if struck by sudden awareness, he stepped back. "Forgive me," he said hoarsely. "I should not—" "Do not apologize for being human, my lord," she said, her voice trembling. He drew a long breath, as though trying to steady himself. "You have no idea what danger lies in this." "I am not afraid," she whispered, his eyes softened. "No," he said, "you never are." That evening, the sky darkened into a bruised violet, and the manor filled with shadows. Millicent sat by the parlour fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The faint echo of their conversation lingered in her mind, each word replaying like the melody of a song she could not stop hearing. She did not know what would come of this fragile bond between them, but she knew it had already taken root. Something irreversible had begun the moment he spoke her name. As the firelight flickered, Victor appeared in the doorway, the glow casting half his face in light, half in shadow. "You are still awake," he said quietly. "I could not sleep." "Nor I." He stepped closer, and the tension returned, sweet, unbearable. "There is something I must say," he murmured. "Today, when Kara was here, I realized something. I do not wish to face my battles alone anymore." She rose slowly. "You do not have to." "No," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "I do not. But you must understand, I have never chosen anyone freely in my life. Until now." Her breath caught. "You mean—" "I mean that you are no longer here by arrangement or duty. You are here because I wish it." The world seemed to still. The fire crackled softly, throwing gold across the floor. Millicent felt tears gather, though her voice was steady. "Then allow me to stay, not because you owe me shelter, but because you wish me near." He reached for her hand, lifting it slowly, reverently, to his lips. "That," he said, his voice low, "is precisely why I cannot let you go." Her fingers trembled in his grasp. "And yet," she whispered, "you will not take what is not freely given." "Never," he said. "I will only wait until you wish to give it." Their hands lingered, the air between them shimmering with restrained feeling. For the first time, Millicent saw in Victor's eyes not the distance of nobility, but the vulnerability of a man learning to love again. And though neither spoke another word, both understood that something irrevocable had been sealed between them, not in vow or touch, but in the sacred stillness of that moment. Outside, the rain began to fall softly once more, drumming gently against the windows. Thornley breathed in rhythm with it, alive again after years of silence. Inside its walls, love, fragile, forbidden but true, had begun to bloom. A storm rolled in from the hills before dawn, cloaking Thornley in shadow. The rain came hard against the windows, a restless drumming that seemed to echo the turmoil rising quietly within its walls. Candles flickered in the corridors, their flames bending toward unseen draughts, and servants moved softly, speaking in hushed tones as though the storm itself were listening. Millicent awoke to the sound of distant thunder. She sat up slowly, the silk coverlet slipping from her shoulders, her breath misting faintly in the cool air. The memory of the previous night, Victor's words, the tenderness in his voice, the way he had lifted her hand to his lips, still trembled inside her like a secret. It frightened her, that depth of feeling, and yet she could not deny the warmth it had left behind. After dressing, she descended to the breakfast room, expecting the calm, domestic rhythm she had begun to know. Instead, she found the air charged with unease. Mrs. Larkin stood near the sideboard, her usual composure faltering. "My lady," she murmured, "his lordship has been in his study since before sunrise. A messenger arrived. Urgent correspondence, I believe." "Is he unwell?" Millicent asked quickly. Mrs. Larkin hesitated. "Not in body, perhaps, but his temper has grown dark this morning." Millicent's heart tightened. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will speak with him." When she reached the study, the door stood half open. Victor's voice drifted through the gap, low, measured, but edged with iron. "I will not yield," he said. "Tell them that." Millicent stepped inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting the room in shades of amber and grey. Victor stood behind his desk, the light catching the hard angles of his face. He held a letter in one hand, crumpled from his grip. He looked up at her, his expression softening only slightly. "Millicent, forgive me. I did not mean for you to see me like this." "You need not apologize," she said gently. "Mrs. Larkin told me you had troubling news," He turned away, staring into the fire. There are men who circle Thornley like wolves, waiting for me to falter. One of them, the worst among them, has returned. Millicent stepped closer. Who is he? A cousin, Victor said with quiet contempt. Philip Ashcombe. He believes the title should have been his. And now he uses the debts of my father to challenge what he calls my unfit stewardship. Her pulse quickened. Can he truly threaten your position? Victor's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Not by law, but law bends easily for men who trade in lies. He means to turn the village and the magistrate against me, perhaps even London if he can. And scandal, as you know, is a weapon sharper than any blade. Millicent felt a chill run through her. He will not succeed. You are not the man those rumors claim you to be. He looked at her then, his eyes dark with something like sorrow. You speak as though truth matters in such games. It rarely does. Then let me stand with you, she said. The words slipped out before she could restrain them. She saw surprise flash across his face, followed by something far deeper. Stand with me? He repeated softly. You have already endured too much because of me. I endured what others forced upon me, she said, her voice trembling with conviction. This, she gestured between them, this would be my choice. Victor's gaze lingered on her, full of unspoken emotion. You are braver than I deserve, and you are lonelier than you admit, she whispered. The air between them shifted, thickened. He took a slow step forward, then another, until they stood within arm's reach. The light from the fire brushed against his face, revealing the tension in his jaw, the gentleness barely restrained in his eyes. Millicent, he said, his voice low. If you knew the danger of being seen beside me in what is to come, you would not offer such loyalty so easily. I am not afraid of what others see, she replied. I am afraid of what you might lose if you keep fighting alone. He exhaled, the breath shuddering from him as though her words had reached some hidden wound. For a moment, he did not speak. Then, slowly, he said, You speak as though you have faith in me. I do, she said simply. The silence that followed was alive with feeling. His hand rose, hesitant, reverent, and for an instant hovered near her face before falling away, restrained by habit, by fear of overstepping. Then, let us hope your faith is not misplaced, he murmured. Before Millicent could reply, there was a sharp knock at the door. The butler entered, bowing stiffly. Forgive me, my lord, but Mr. Carow is here again. He insists on seeing you. Victor's expression hardened. Of course he does. Millicent stepped back, composing herself. Should I leave? No. Victor said, his voice steady. If he has come to test my resolve, he will see it is not mine alone. Mr. Carow entered moments later, his presence unsettling the calm of the room. He was a man of medium height with sharp eyes and the air of someone who believed he owned every room he entered. His bow to Millicent was shallow and mocking. Lady Thornley, he said, his tone smooth as oil. How radiant you look. The manner seems enlivened since your arrival. Your concern is unnecessary, Victor said coldly. Speak your business. Carow smiled faintly. So direct, as always. Very well. I come on behalf of certain parties interested in ensuring that the Ashcombe estates are managed properly. There are whispers, my lord, that your affairs are less than orderly. Victor's voice sharpened. My affairs are not for others to manage or to gossip about. Carow's gaze flicked toward Millicent. I hear many things, my lord, and not only about the estate. It seems the village wonders what sort of woman has captured the elusive Marquis's attention. They say she was once in disgrace, yet now presides over Thornley as if born to it. Millicent stiffened, but before she could speak, Victor's voice cut through the air like steel. Enough. You will not speak of my wife with that tongue. Carow lifted his brows. Your wife? Ah, so it is official then. I had heard the ceremony was unconventional. Get out, Victor said, the quiet in his tone more dangerous than any shout. Caro lingered a moment longer, clearly savouring the tension. "As you wish. But know this, my lord. Wolves do not knock only once. They circle, they wait, and they always return when the scent of blood is strong." When he was gone, the silence in the study was almost unbearable. Victor's hands had clenched into fists. Millicent crossed the room slowly, stopping just beside him. "You must not let him see he has power over you." Victor looked at her, his voice low and rough. "He does not, but he knows where to strike. He will use you against me. That is his way." "Then he underestimates me," she said. "He will find I am not so easily broken." A faint smile touched his lips, despite the weight of the moment. "You are extraordinary, Millicent." Her breath caught at the sound of her name on his lips, the quiet reverence of it. "I am only trying to protect what matters." "And what is that?" he asked softly. She met his gaze without flinching. "You!" The word hung between them, fragile and powerful. Victor's composure faltered. He reached for her hand, his fingers curling gently around hers. "You should not care for me," he said. "I am not a man made for gentleness." "Then I shall teach you what gentleness is," she whispered. The thunder outside seemed to echo her words, rolling across the hills. For a moment, the storm and the silence of the room became one heartbeat. Victor's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a touch both hesitant and protective. "Millicent," he murmured, "I have faced battles of blood and honor without fear. Yet standing before you, I find myself utterly defenseless." "Then do not fight," she said softly. "Just feel." He released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to let her go. "If I allow myself to feel, I may never be able to stop." "Then let that be your freedom," she replied. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze, for fear of what she might see. "You have no idea what you risk by loving a man the world wants to destroy." She moved closer, until the hem of her gown brushed against his boot. "Then let the world try. It cannot destroy what it does not understand." Their eyes met once more, and for a moment the storm outside became only a whisper against the glass. Later that afternoon, as the rain began to ease, Millicent walked through the manor halls, her heart still trembling from their exchange. Servants nodded respectfully as she passed, but she hardly saw them. Every word Victor had spoken seemed to linger in the air, alive with promise and pain. In the drawing-room she paused by the window. The clouds were parting at last, and a faint, fragile sunlight broke through, spilling gold over the soaked gardens. It felt like an omen, brief, uncertain, but beautiful. Behind her a voice spoke quietly. "You were right about the morning," Victor said. "Even storms give way to light." She turned, surprised to see him there, his expression gentler than she had ever seen it. "I feared you would lock yourself away again," she said softly. "I tried," he admitted, but the silence felt heavier than before. She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps silence has lost its power over you." "Perhaps," he said. Then after a pause, "You stood beside me today, even when I did not ask it. I will not forget that." "You need not remember," she murmured. "You only need to let me stay." He stepped closer, and though he did not touch her, the space between them pulsed with quiet understanding. "Then stay," he whispered. As the light faded and the air filled with the scent of wet earth, Thornley stood renewed, its heart no longer ruled by ghosts, but by two souls finding strength in each other. And though the wolves might circle still within the walls of that ancient manor, love had found its ground. The dawn broke pale and cold over Thornley, its first light touching the windows like hesitant fingers. The storm of the previous day had washed the countryside clean, leaving the hills shining with dew. The manor seemed calmer now, its silence no longer heavy with secrets, but fragile, expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Millicent stood at her window, gazing at the horizon, where mist curled around the trees. She had not slept much. Her thoughts were full of Victor, his voice, his nearness, the weight of his gaze when he said she was his choice. It frightened her, How deeply she felt it. What had begun as compassion had become something far more dangerous. A quiet devotion that she could neither name nor deny. When Mrs. Larkin entered with her morning tray, Millicent turned quickly, forcing composure into her features. "His lordship is expecting you in the east parlour," the housekeeper said with a knowing smile. "He asked if you might join him for tea before noon." Millicent's pulse quickened. "Did he say why?" Mrs. Larkin's smile deepened. "He did not, my lady, but I suspect it is not estate business that brings him to the parlour today." Left alone, Millicent took a deep breath and allowed herself a moment before the mirror. Her gown was soft lilac silk, trimmed with ivory lace, a gift from Victor she had only dared to wear once before. She pinned her dark hair into an elegant twist, leaving 2 curls to fall at her temples. When she looked at her reflection, she hardly recognized the girl who had arrived at Thornley weeks ago. That girl had been afraid to be seen. Now she feared only being forgotten. The east parlour glowed with morning light when she entered. Victor stood by the window, his dark coat immaculate, his cravat perfectly tied. The sunlight caught in his hair, turning it to a deep bronze. He turned at the sound of her steps, and for a heartbeat, something unguarded flickered across his face. Admiration, and perhaps something more. "My lady," he said softly, bowing his head. "You look radiant." Millicent blushed. "The morning is kind to me, my lord." "The morning," he said, "has nothing to do with it." He gestured to the table where tea had been set, china of fine porcelain, a vase of fresh garden roses between the cups. The gesture was simple, yet it carried weight. He had thought of this, prepared it. "I wished for peace today," Victor said, as he poured her tea. "After so many storms, I thought we might have a morning without shadows." She smiled gently. "Then we must hold it carefully, lest it vanish too soon." Indeed, they sat opposite each other, the soft clink of porcelain marking the rhythm of their silence. Outside, the garden shimmered with light, and through the open window came the faint scent of lavender and earth. "Millicent," Victor said at last, his voice low and thoughtful, "do you believe that some things in life are meant, fated even, no matter how one resists them?" She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I do not know. I think we choose our fates when we decide whom to trust, whom to forgive. The rest may be chance or providence." He studied her for a long moment. "Then perhaps providence has been kinder to me than I deserve." "Because I am here?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said simply. "Because you are here." The air between them deepened, a tender quiet that neither dared to break. Then, before she could speak again, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. The butler entered, bowing quickly. "Forgive me, my lord, but Mr. Philip Ashcombe has arrived. He insists upon an audience." Millicent's stomach tightened. Victor's expression darkened. "Show him to the drawing-room," he said curtly, "and send word to the steward. I will attend him shortly." When the door closed, he turned to her. "You should not be present for this. Then you know it will not go well." He hesitated, then nodded. "My cousin comes for one reason only, to provoke. He delights in what he can wound. I will not allow him to turn his cruelty toward you." "And then let me stand with you," she said, echoing the words she had once spoken before. "Your enemies must see that you are not alone." His eyes softened. "Millicent, if you stand beside me today, there is no turning back. Whatever he says, whatever venom he spits, it will mark you too." "Then let me be marked," she whispered. "I would rather bear your burden than watch you bear it alone." He looked at her for a long time, the air trembling between them. Finally, he offered his arm. "Then come." The drawing-room was already charged with tension when they entered. Philip Ashcombe stood near the hearth, a man of handsome features but cold eyes, his elegance marred by arrogance. His coat was finely tailored, his smile sharp and false. "Cousin," Philip said with exaggerated civility, bowing slightly. "You do me an honor." Victor's reply was steady. "I did not invite you, Philip. What do you want?" Only justice, the man said smoothly. Or perhaps fairness. I hear whispers that Thornley suffers under mismanagement, that its once noble lord has grown sentimental, distracted. His gaze slid to Millicent, lingering just long enough to make her blood run cold. I see the source of that distraction now. Victor's tone turned to steel. You will speak with respect in this house. Of course, Philip said lightly. I only wonder what the world will think when it learns that the great Marquis of Thornley took for his lady a woman of questionable birth. The scandal writes itself. Millicent's face burned, but she did not look away. You speak boldly for a man who hides behind gossip. Philip's smile faltered. The lady defends him. How charming. She defends truth, Victor said, his voice cutting through the air. Something foreign to you. Philip's expression hardened. You cannot silence me, Victor. The truth will surface soon enough. When it does, even your precious wife will see the kind of man you truly are. Victor took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. Leave this house before I forget we share blood. Philip's smirk returned, though faintly. I'll go, but you cannot banish what you fear. You built Thornley on secrets, cousin. And secrets, as you know, rot the foundations of even the grandest estates. When he left, the room seemed to exhale. Victor stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Millicent approached him quietly. Do not let him undo you. He turned to her, eyes shadowed with anger and hurt. He knows too much, and he will use it. There are things in my past I would have buried forever, but he will drag them into the light. She reached for him, her voice gentle but firm. Then face them. Whatever they are, they do not define you now. You speak as if redemption were simple, he said bitterly. It is not simple, she said, but it is possible. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the fight seemed to drain from him. How do you do that? He whispered. How do you make me believe in things I abandoned long ago? Because I see who you are, she said softly, not what you have been. He stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing like breath on glass. His hand lifted, hovering near her cheek but not touching. If I fall, Millicent, he said, you will fall with me. Then I will fall gladly, she answered. The words broke whatever restraint remained. He drew her into his arms, not in passion, but in desperate need. She felt his heart hammering against hers, the strength in his embrace tempered by fear, as though he might lose her if he held her too tightly. When he pulled back, his voice was hoarse. Forgive me. I am not myself. She looked up at him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Then, perhaps this is the truest you have ever been. He stared at her, torn between reason and longing. You do not know what you risk. I know, she whispered, but I would rather risk pain than silence. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was the steward, pale and uneasy. My lord, there is something you should see. A rider delivered this only moments ago. Victor took the folded letter. His expression changed as he read. Shock first, then fury. What is it? Millicent asked. He looked up, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Philip has gone to the magistrate. He means to bring formal charges of deceit, claims that I falsified documents to secure my inheritance. Millicent felt her heart drop. But that is untrue. Truth is irrelevant, Victor said grimly. He seeks ruin, not justice. Without another word he strode toward the door. Millicent followed him into the hall. Where are you going? She asked. To end this, he said, before he poisons the entire county with his lies. Then I'm coming with you. He turned sharply. No, you must remain here. I will not hide behind your walls while others drag your name through mud, she said, her voice rising. If I am to be part of your life, then I will stand in its light and its shadow alike. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, then at last said, You are extraordinary, Millicent Hawthorne, and far braver than I. She smiled faintly. Then let us be brave together. He said nothing, only took her hand. his fingers closing around hers with a strength that made her breath catch. Outside, the clouds had gathered again, grey and heavy, as if the world mirrored their turmoil. They rode toward the village in silence, the wind snapping Victor's cloak and tangling Millicent's hair. When they reached the square, people had already gathered, faces curious, fearful, eager for spectacle. Philip stood among them, all charm and false righteousness. When he saw them dismount, his smile widened. "Ah, the Marquis graces us with his presence," he said loudly, "and his lady too. How fitting." Victor's voice carried clear and calm. "You spread lies because you cannot build truth of your own. You call yourself a man of justice, yet all you seek is inheritance unearned." Philip sneered. "You would say that, wouldn't you? But when the papers come to light, the world will see that Thornley was never truly yours." Before Victor could speak again, Millicent stepped forward. Her voice was steady, ringing through the square. "You call yourself noble, Mr. Ashcombe, yet you behave like a coward. A man who destroys others to feel powerful is not noble. He is small." The murmurs around them grew louder. Philip's expression faltered for the first time. Victor looked at her with awe, and something deeper, fiercer. "Enough," he said to Philip. "Leave this place before your deceit becomes your undoing." Philip glared, but the crowd had shifted. Whispers turned against him now, and his confidence waned. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, the sound of his boots fading into the murmur of the village. As silence fell, Millicent felt Victor's hand find hers once more. His grip was warm, grounding. "You should not have spoken," he murmured. "It was dangerous." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but it was necessary." He looked down at her, a quiet wonder in his eyes. "You stood before them all, and you saved my honor," she smiled faintly. "No, my lord, I merely reminded them of yours." As they rode back toward Thornley, the sky broke open again, sunlight spilling through the clouds. Victor reached across the space between their horses, his gloved hand brushing hers briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it carried more than any promise could. Trust, gratitude, and the first true spark of love returned in kind. For the first time in years, Victor Ashcombe smiled without restraint, and Millicent, feeling his warmth beside her, knew that whatever trials awaited them, she would no longer face them alone. The autumn air had changed. The days grew shorter, the light softer, and the scent of the fields around Thornley carried the faint sweetness of fading leaves. Evening descended like a veil of silver, and the manor stood bathed in the amber glow of lanterns. It had been several days since the confrontation in the village square, and though calm had returned to the estate, it was a fragile calm, like still water, hiding unseen depth. Millicent walked through the corridor toward the library, her fingers brushing along the dark wood panels. Since that day, the servants regarded her with quiet admiration. The villagers spoke her name with respect, yet her thoughts were not on pride, but on Victor. He had withdrawn slightly, not out of coldness, but of reflection. He spent hours alone, riding through the moors or writing long letters he never sent. She sensed he was trying to protect her from something, perhaps from himself. When she reached the library, she found him there, seated by the fire. His coat lay folded on the armchair beside him, his shirt sleeves rolled just above his forearms. The light from the fire cast his face in shades of gold and shadow. He looked up at her entrance, his eyes softening in the way that always stole her breath. "You should be resting," he said quietly. "You've had little peace since the storm you weathered for me." "I could say the same for you," she replied, walking closer. "You have been quieter than usual." "Have I?" he asked, though he already knew it was true. She nodded, sitting near the fire opposite him. "You keep your thoughts hidden, Victor, even when you think them loud enough to wake the house." He smiled faintly. "You read me too easily." "I see only what you allow me to see," she said softly. For a while, silence fell between them. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the wind against the windows. The intimacy of the moment made her pulse quicken. Finally, Victor spoke. "I have been thinking of what was said in the square, and of how you faced Philip without fear. You were extraordinary, Millicent." She lowered her gaze. "I only spoke what was true." "Yes," he said, "but few have ever spoken for me before. It has left me uncertain. I am not used to being defended." "You defend others," she reminded him gently. "It is time someone did the same for you." He looked at her then, his expression unguarded. "When I first brought you here, I believed I was offering you safety. Now I see that it is you who has offered it to me." Her heart fluttered. "Then keep it," she whispered. He studied her face in the dim light, every flicker of the fire reflected in his grey eyes. "Do you know," he said slowly, "that before you came, I thought myself incapable of affection. I believed kindness had left me forever. But each time I see you, I begin to feel again. I begin to remember what life was meant to be." Millicent's voice trembled as she answered. "And what was it meant to be?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "This. The quiet between two hearts that no longer know where one ends and the other begins." Her breath caught, her pulse racing. "Victor." He stood then, walking to the window. The night beyond was thick with mist, the trees swaying gently in the moonlight. "You changed this house," he said, his voice distant but full of emotion. "It no longer feels like a tomb, and yet the more light you bring, the more afraid I become of losing it." She rose slowly and went to him. "Do you believe happiness is so fragile that it must be feared?" "I have learned that joy is dangerous," he said, his tone low and haunted. "It makes men careless. It makes them believe they are safe." Millicent stood beside him, the reflection of the fire glimmering in her eyes. "And yet, what is life without it?" He turned to her, and their faces were close, so close that she could see the fine line of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the faint tremor in his jaw. "If I told you I am not worthy of you," he murmured, "would you believe me?" "No," she said softly. "Because worth is not measured by what others say you deserve. It is measured by how you love." He looked at her for a long time, as if memorizing her words. Then his voice deepened. "And if I told you that I love you?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The words hung in the air, trembling, alive. She met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Then I would tell you that you are not alone in it." The air between them changed, charged, tender, unbreakable. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that felt sacred. The touch was feather-light, but it set her entire being alight. "Millicent," he whispered, his breath close enough that she felt its warmth, "you have given me back my soul." Her voice was barely a breath. "And you have given me back my name." He smiled faintly, his thumb lingering at her chin. "I have never seen anyone like you. You carry peace where others bring chaos. You speak softly, and yet the world changes around you." "Then let it change," she said, her voice trembling. "Let it change for us." The clock in the corner struck 8, its chime echoing gently. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves. Victor took her hand and led her toward the hearth. "Sit with me," he said. "For once, let us not think of duty or danger." She obeyed, and they sat close enough that their hands brushed. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was full, not empty, but alive, like the pause before a confession. After a while, he said quietly, "I was 12 when my mother died. My father taught me that a man must never show what he feels. He said it was weakness, and I believed him for years. Until you." Millicent listened, her heart aching at the fragility behind his words. "Then your father was wrong." "Perhaps," Victor said, "but habits built on pain are difficult to break." She reached out and took his hand in hers, surprising even herself with the boldness of it. "Then let me help you break them." He looked down at their joined hands, his fingers closed around hers slowly, as if testing the reality of her touch. "You would stay, even knowing the world may turn against us?" "I would stay," she said firmly, because what I have found here is worth more than the world's approval." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a quiet exhale, he whispered, "You will undo me, Millicent Hawthorne." "Then let me rebuild you," she replied. The fire crackled softly, casting warmth over their faces. Victor's hand rose again, this time more certain. He brushed his knuckles against her lips, his touch trembling slightly. It was not passion that burned between them, but recognition, the meeting of two souls that had been wandering in darkness and finally found home. When she looked into his eyes, she saw the man he truly was, strong yet vulnerable, scarred yet capable of love. "You once said you could not forget the past," she whispered, "but the past cannot haunt you if you choose to forgive yourself." He closed his eyes briefly, her words sinking into the deepest parts of him. "You make forgiveness sound simple." "It is not simple," she said, "but it begins with love." He opened his eyes again, and in that look was everything: regret, longing, tenderness, and the first true surrender. "Then, Millicent," he murmured, his voice low and reverent, "teach me how." She smiled through the tears that had gathered in her eyes. "By staying," she said, "by believing that tomorrow can still be kind." He leaned closer, until their foreheads almost touched. The moment stretched, delicate as silk. Every unspoken feeling passed between them: trust, hope, the promise of something lasting. When the fire finally burned low, Victor spoke again, barely above a whisper. "If I live 100 years, I will remember this night." Millicent's lips curved into a tender smile. "Then remember it as the night your heart learned its truth." Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, bathing the garden in silver light. Inside, the library glowed with warmth and quiet joy. Two souls, long starved of tenderness, sat in the hush of shared understanding, and though the world beyond Thornley would not cease its storms, within those walls, love had finally taken root, not as a fragile bloom, but as something enduring, powerful enough to defy the darkness that had once ruled them both. The morning dawned grey and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. A quiet melancholy had settled over Thornley Manor, though its rooms still glowed faintly with the warmth of the previous night. In the hours that had passed, something had changed between Millicent and Victor, something unspoken yet undeniable. The honesty of his confession, the fragile tenderness in his voice, lingered between them like a vow neither dared to utter aloud. Millicent woke early, unable to rest. She wrapped herself in a soft wool shawl and went to the garden before the storm could break. The air was cool and fragrant with damp earth. She moved along the gravel path, her slippers brushing lightly against the stones, her fingers grazing the dew-heavy roses. Each petal seemed to shimmer with its own heartbeat. She felt alive in a way she never had before, alive and trembling with something she could not quite name. But beneath the calm, an unease stirred. For days, letters had arrived bearing the same seal, dark wax stamped with a serpent. Victor never spoke of them, but she had seen the weight they left in his eyes. Whatever piece they had found was delicate, balanced on the edge of something unseen. The sound of boots on the path startled her from her thoughts. Victor was approaching, his dark coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. His hair was damp from the mist, his expression grave but softened when he saw her. "You rise with the dawn," he said quietly. "I could not sleep," she replied. "The air feels restless, as though the sky itself is holding its breath." He came to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "It suits you," he murmured. "This hour before the world wakes, you look as though you belong to the light before day." She smiled faintly. "And you belong to the silence before the storm." He turned to her, a spark of amusement in his eyes. "Then we are well matched." The moment might have been peaceful, if not for the faint sound of hooves echoing from the road beyond the gate. Victor's face changed instantly. He looked toward the distant path, the line of his shoulders tensing. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I fear I know who it is." Within minutes, a carriage came into view. a sleek, black vehicle drawn by two grey horses. The emblem on its door gleamed even through the mist, the serpent seal she had seen on the letters. Victor's tone darkened. "Lord Wycliffe," he said, "Philip's ally, and the man who financed his schemes. He comes now to collect the debts my father left, or to make me kneel before his arrogance." Millicent's heart tightened. "You will not face him alone." "Millicent, do not send me away," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "If I am to share your name, I must share what it bears." He hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but promise me this. You will not answer him in anger. Wycliffe knows how to twist kindness into shame." "I will promise nothing except honesty," she said softly. When the carriage arrived, Lord Wycliffe stepped out, a tall man with silver hair, his face sharp as carved stone. His clothes were of impeccable quality, his every movement steeped in entitlement. He looked at the manor as though it were already his. "Ah, Thornley," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "how the mighty estates of England do fall into ruin when left to sentimental men." Victor's jaw tightened. "You will speak plainly, my lord. What brings you here?" "Business, of course. The Ashcombe debts remain unsettled. The court has little patience for lingering accounts." "This is not the court," Victor said, "and you are not its voice." Wycliffe's smile curved like a blade. "Perhaps not, but the law favors those who can afford to be heard. I have come to make you an offer. Sell Thornley to me, and I shall see your debts erased. Refuse, and I will see them multiplied." Millicent stepped forward before Victor could answer. "You speak as though honor can be bought, my lord, but Thornley is not for sale." Wycliffe turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her with condescension. "Ah, the lady herself. I had heard whispers of the Marquis' charitable marriage. Tell me, my dear, is loyalty truly worth the price of ruin?" Victor's voice cut through the air. "That is enough." Wycliffe smirked. "You would do well to mind your temper, cousin. The last time you defied me, you lost everything that bore your father's name." Millicent's breath caught. "Cousin?" Wycliffe's eyes gleamed. "Ah, he has not told you." "Yes, Lady Thornley. I am of the same blood that runs through his veins, though mine, I assure you, is less tainted by scandal." "Leave this place," Victor said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "Whatever claim you believe you hold, it ends at my gate." But Wycliffe only smiled, turning toward Millicent again. "Do you truly know the man you defend, my lady? Do you know what he did to keep this estate, the price he paid, or rather the one others paid in his stead?" Millicent looked at Victor, her heart thundering. "What does he mean?" Victor's silence was answer enough. Wycliffe's grin widened. "It seems your husband has neglected to mention that the Thornley lands were purchased not through inheritance, but through deceit. A forged signature, a manipulated will. Oh, it was quite the scandal before it was hushed, but I have proof, and the magistrate will have it soon enough." "You lie," Victor said, though his tone faltered with the weight of old guilt. Wycliffe shrugged. "Believe what you wish. By the week's end, Thornley will be mine. And when that day comes, I do hope you find comfort, Lady Thornley, in knowing that your loyalty was misplaced." He turned and walked back toward his carriage, his laughter mingling with the rising wind. When he was gone, Millicent turned to Victor. "Tell me it isn't true." He looked at her with eyes full of pain. "It is not as he said, but there is truth in the shadow." "Then tell me the truth," she whispered. Victor's voice broke. "When my father died, the estate was drowning in debt. I was desperate to save it, for the people who worked the land, for the servants who had nowhere else to go. I signed papers I should not have signed, trusted a lawyer who promised discretion. It was wrong, but I did not do it for greed. I did it to keep Thornley alive." Millicent's eyes filled with tears. "And now he will use that against you." "Yes," Victor said quietly, "and if he succeeds, everything will be lost." She reached for him, her voice trembling. "Then let me help you fight." He stepped back, shaking his head. "No, Millicent, this is not your burden. You have given me light. I will not let you share my disgrace." "Disgrace?" she cried softly. "You call it disgrace to act out of love? You think me so fragile that I cannot bear the truth?" He turned away, his shoulders tense. "You do not understand what ruin feels like." "Then teach me," she said. "Show me the truth and I will still stand beside you." He faced her then, the storm in his eyes breaking. "Why?" he asked, almost pleading. "Why do you keep fighting for me?" "Because I love you," she said, the words falling like a confession into the air between them. "Because you are worth every wound I must take to prove it." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cold against their faces. Victor stared at her, his breath uneven. "Say it again." "I love you," she whispered, her voice shaking but sure. "I love you, Victor Ashcombe, not for what you own, but for what you are when no one is watching." He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, his hands trembling as they cupped her face. His forehead pressed against hers, and for a long moment neither spoke. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the stone terrace, soaking the hem of her gown and his coat. "You have undone me completely," he murmured. "I thought I was beyond redemption, and now I cannot imagine my life without you." "Then do not imagine it," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Live it." He drew her closer, not to possess, but to seek shelter in her strength. The storm raged around them, but the air between them was full of quiet heat, of fragile, trembling devotion. When he finally pulled back, his thumb brushed the tear from her cheek. "You should not have to bear my sins." "I will bear them," she said softly, "because they no longer belong only to you." He smiled through his pain, the faintest curve of his lips. "Then I am yours, Millicent, entirely and forever." The thunder rolled in the distance, and she leaned against him, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. Outside, the rain fell without mercy, washing away the dust of old lies and the fear of what tomorrow might bring. In that moment, beneath the downpour, they were not a Marquis and his wife, nor 2 souls bound by duty. They were simply a man and a woman who had finally learned that love, when born in truth, could survive even the fiercest storm. And as the last light of day faded behind the clouds, Thornley Manor stood silent and proud once more. Not as a monument to power, but as a sanctuary for hearts that had dared to fight for one another. The rain that had poured over Thornley the day before did not end abruptly. It softened, thinned, became a steady veil that clung to the stone walls and the garden hedges, as if the sky refused to let go of what it had witnessed. The manor awoke under a pewter light, the world rinsed clean, but still trembling with consequence. Millicent sat at the small writing desk in her chamber, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The paper before her remained blank, though the ink had been ready for an hour. Every time she tried to shape words, she felt Victor's confession again, his desperation, his shame, the way his hands had held her face beneath the downpour, as if she were the only truth he could trust. A quiet knock sounded at her door. Before she could answer, Mrs. Larkin entered, her expression grave. "My lady," she said softly, "his lordship is in the study." A messenger came at dawn. "There is urgency." Millicent rose at once. She did not ask for details. Her body already knew the shape of fear. The corridor felt colder than usual as she walked, the portraits along the wall watching her with silent judgment. At the study door, she paused only a heartbeat, then entered. Victor stood by the window with his back half-turned. The pale light outlined his shoulders, the rigid set of them. He held a bundle of papers in one hand, and his other hand was clenched so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. When he heard her footsteps, he turned. His eyes, those winter-grey eyes that had begun to soften since she came, looked dark again, not with cruelty, but with a familiar self-punishment that made her chest ache. "They have moved quickly," he said, voice low. "Wycliffe delivered his proof to the magistrate in Bristol. A hearing has been scheduled. He intends to make it public." Millicent crossed the room to him without hesitation. "Then we will face it." Victor's gaze searched her, almost pleading. "Millicent, last night you spoke words I have no right to hold you to. You could still step away from this. You could claim ignorance, protect your name." "My name?" she repeated softly, incredulous. "My name was used as a leash long before I ever came here. I will not be protected by cowardice. I will be protected by truth." He inhaled, as if her courage struck him like a blow. "Truth does not always win. It does when the right people refuse to surrender it," she replied. Victor lowered his gaze to the papers in his hand. He held them out to her slowly, as though revealing them might strip him bare. "These are my father's accounts," he said. "And these," he tapped another document, "the legal papers that settled certain obligations after his death. The lawyer I trusted is dead now. The man who replaced him altered the record to make it appear I forged a signature. Wycliffe has that altered copy." Millicent's eyes skimmed the lines, the neat handwriting, the seals. She did not pretend expertise, but she recognized something far more important than law. Motive, a pattern, the way men had always rewritten stories to suit their hunger. She looked up at Victor. "You said you signed papers you should not have signed. What exactly did you sign?" His jaw tightened. "A promissory agreement, a private loan. I believed it would keep the estate afloat until I could restructure rents and sell timber. It was meant to be lawful, only discreet. But the solicitor used that discretion to hide his own corruption. And when I questioned him, he threatened exposure." Millicent stepped closer. "Then we will expose him instead." Victor gave a bitter exhale. "He is gone. Wycliffe remains." "Then we expose Wycliffe's hunger," she said. Victor looked at her as though he was seeing the shape of hope for the first time in years. "How?" Millicent didn't answer with a grand speech. She answered with movement. She went to the desk, opened a drawer Victor rarely used, and pulled out a small ledger Mrs. Larkin had once mentioned, records of tenant accounts kept in the housekeeper's careful hand. She placed it on the desk and looked at Victor with a steady calm that felt like a vow. "Because Thornley is not only paper and seals," she said, "it is people, and people remember." Victor's expression shifted, confusion, then realization. "You mean testimony," he murmured. "I mean the steward's records, the tenants who watched you rebuild, the servants who saw you refuse cruelty, the shopkeepers who know Wycliffe's methods," she said. "I mean truth with breathing lungs." Victor stared at her, and in that stare was a kind of awe that made her throat tighten. "You are relentless," he said softly. "I am free," she replied, "and I intend to stay that way." Before he could answer, another knock came, sharper this time. The butler entered, pale. "My lord," he said, "there is a lady at the gate. She insists upon seeing you. She claims she has information that will decide the matter." Victor's face went still. "Who?" The butler swallowed. "Mrs. Hawthorne." Millicent felt the world tilt. The name struck like a slap, sharp and humiliating. For a moment she could smell again the parlour at Hawthorne House, could hear the theatrical sigh, could feel the sting of being displayed like a lesson. Victor's eyes snapped to Millicent, his voice firm. "You do not have to see her." Millicent lifted her chin. "Yes," she said quietly, "I do." When Mrs. Hawthorne entered the drawing-room, she looked as though she had dressed herself for forgiveness. Her gown was dark and fine, her gloves immaculate, her hair arranged with the same precision she used to arrange cruelty. Yet there was something desperate behind her practiced composure, as if she had finally realized that power could slip. "My lord," she began, dipping into a curtsy that bordered on theatrical. "Lady Thornley." Millicent did not offer her a seat. Victor's voice was cold. "You have no right to appear here." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flashed, then softened into false humility. "I come because circumstances have changed. I have learned, through acquaintances, that Lord Wycliffe intends to destroy you. I believed it would be wise to intervene." Millicent's voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Intervene, or bargain." Mrs. Hawthorne looked wounded. "Millicent, I have only ever done what was necessary." Millicent felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused tears. "Necessary for whom?" Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze slid to Victor, her tone shifting into silk. "My lord, you must understand the position I was in. A young woman in my household, a reputation at risk, debts piling." Victor's voice cut through. "Do not dress your cruelty in virtue." For a heartbeat, Mrs. Hawthorne's mask slipped. Then she recovered, drawing a folded bundle from her reticule. "I did not come to argue," she said. "I came to offer what you will need. Proof." Millicent's breath caught. Mrs. Hawthorne placed the bundle on the table. Within it were letters, old yellowed paper, and a small sealed receipt bearing a familiar serpent emblem. Victor stepped forward, eyes narrowing. He did not touch the papers at once, as if afraid they were poison. "What is this?" he demanded. Mrs. Hawthorne lifted her chin. "Correspondence between Lord Wycliffe and your cousin Philip. The arrangement, the payment, the plan to manufacture evidence against you." Millicent stared at her, disbelief and suspicion warring in her chest. "Why would you have these?" Mrs. Hawthorne's voice turned careful. "Because Philip came to me first. He wanted support in the village. He wanted influence, and he assumed I would provide it, given my history with Millicent." Millicent's stomach tightened, the humiliation returning. Victor's posture stiffened, the threat in him awakening. "You allied with him?" Victor asked, voice like ice. Mrs. Hawthorne lifted a hand quickly. "Only briefly. I did not know Wycliffe would come himself. I did not know he would aim for the estate rather than merely ruin." Millicent's laugh was soft, almost soundless. "You did not care who suffered. You only cared to win." Mrs. Hawthorne flinched, then looked directly at Millicent, an unusual honesty flickering through. "I cared to survive," she whispered. Millicent's voice remained steady. "And I cared to live. There is a difference." Victor finally picked up the receipt and scanned it. His eyes sharpened, then darkened with realization. The serpent seal was unmistakable. So was the handwriting at the bottom, Philip's. He looked at Millicent. For the first time in days, something like certainty entered his expression. "This can break them," he said quietly. Mrs. Hawthorne exhaled, relief blooming on her face as if she expected gratitude. "Then we are agreed, in exchange." Millicent stepped forward, voice calm as a blade. "No," Mrs. Hawthorne blinked. "No? You do not come here and demand payment for decency you never possessed," Millicent said. "If you wish to do one honest thing in your life, do it without reward." Mrs. Hawthorne's lips tightened. "You speak as though you are above me now." Millicent held her gaze. "I am not above you. I am beyond you." Victor's voice was final. "You will leave this house, Mrs. Hawthorne. You will sign a sworn statement to accompany these letters, confirming how you obtained them and what you witnessed. That is the only exchange you will receive, your chance to keep your name from becoming a public disgrace." Mrs. Hawthorne's face went pale. Her pride fought her fear. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I will sign," she whispered. Millicent felt no triumph watching her stepmother's surrender. Only a quiet, aching finality, as if a chapter of her life had closed not with revenge, but with truth. The hearing was held in a magistrate's chambers, crowded with men who smelled of ink and authority. Millicent stood at Victor's side, her gloved hand resting lightly against his sleeve, not clutching him, not hiding behind him, only anchoring him, offering a steadiness he had once believed impossible. Lord Wycliffe arrived with a practiced smile and an air of inevitability. Philip Ashcombe lingered behind him, smug and pale, his confidence propped up by borrowed power. Wycliffe began with polished contempt. "My lord," he said to the magistrate, "this is a matter of forgery and deceit. The Marquis has tampered with legal instruments to secure land that should not be his." Victor's voice was calm. "You will find my hands are cleaner than the men who accuse me." Wycliffe smirked. "Courageous words. Do you have proof?" Victor gestured to the documents. The magistrate examined them. Then Millicent stepped forward, not to speak over Victor, but to deliver what only she could, the moral truth that law often ignored. "My lord," she said to the magistrate, her voice steady, "the man you see here is accused of greed. Yet every person who lives on his land will tell you he lowered rents in lean seasons, that he repaired cottages rather than evict families, that he chose obligation over indulgence. If he signed a desperate agreement when he was young, it was to keep others from starving. That is not greed, that is burden." Wycliffe's eyes narrowed. "Pretty speeches do not change ink." Victor placed Mrs. Hawthorne's sworn statement on the table, along with the letters and receipt. "Then let ink speak." The magistrate read. The room shifted. Even the air seemed to tighten. Wycliffe's smile faltered. Philip's face drained of colour. The magistrate's gaze lifted, sharp. "These letters suggest collusion, payment, a manufactured record." Wycliffe attempted composure. "Forged," he snapped. "All of it." Millicent's voice cut softly through the tension. "Then ask him about the seal." "Udu." The magistrate turned the receipt, examined the serpent emblem. He looked at Wycliffe. Wycliffe's jaw tightened. Victor's voice was low, certain. "That seal is yours, and Philip's hand is on that receipt. If you claim it false, you accuse yourself of negligence so severe it borders on criminal." Philip's control cracked. "He's twisting it." The magistrate raised a hand. "Enough. This matter will not proceed as you intended." Wycliffe's eyes flashed with fury, then calculation. He leaned forward, voice cold. "You think this ends here? England is built on networks, Lady Thornley. On names." Millicent met his gaze without shaking. "Then let England see what your name is worth." The magistrate dismissed the accusations, ordering an inquiry into Wycliffe's conduct and warning Philip against further harassment. The victory was not loud. It was not a grand spectacle. It was a truth placed carefully on the table and finally believed. When they returned to Thornley, dusk had fallen. The manor glowed with lantern light, and the staff stood gathered in the hall, Mrs. Larkin at the front, eyes shining with relief. Victor paused at the threshold, as if unsure he deserved the warmth waiting inside. Millicent slipped her hand into his, fingers lacing with quiet certainty. "You did it," she whispered. Victor's breath trembled. "We did." Inside, the fire had been lit in the great hall, turning the stone walls golden. Victor faced the staff, his voice steady but softened with emotion. "I owe you more than wages," he said. "I owe you my life's meaning. I will not forget who stood with Thornley when others tried to tear it apart." Then his gaze turned to Millicent, and the room seemed to hush in reverence. "And I owe my heart," he said softly, "to the woman who came here as punishment and became my salvation." Heat rose behind Millicent's eyes, but she did not let tears fall. She lifted her chin, letting the world see her strength. Later, when the house had quieted and only the fires remained awake, Victor led Millicent to the conservatory. Once neglected, now gently tended, its glass panes beaded with rain. Candlelight flickered among potted rosemary and late-blooming roses, the air scented with green life. He turned to her, his expression stripped of every shield. "I spent years believing love was a trap," he whispered. "That it would humiliate me, abandon me, destroy me." Millicent stepped closer. "And now?" "Now," he said, voice breaking with tenderness, "I know love is a choice, and I choose you, not because you rescued me from ruin, but because you showed me I could be more than my past." She reached up, her fingertips brushing his cheek, light, reverent, steady. "And I choose you," she whispered, "not because you gave me a title, but because you gave me dignity." Victor's eyes closed briefly, as if the words were too much to hold. "Say it again," he murmured. Millicent smiled through the ache in her chest. "I choose you." He took her hand and pressed it to his heart. "Then let Thornley witness what it has never seen, its Marquis happy." She leaned into him, their foreheads nearly touching, the space between them filled with trembling devotion rather than hunger. The candlelight made his eyes look softer, almost silver. Outside, the rain began again, gentle this time, not a storm but a blessing. Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "You were sold to me as punishment." Millicent's breath caught. "And yet," he continued, "you loved me like I was worth saving." Millicent's voice was equally soft. "Because you are." In the quiet of the conservatory, surrounded by living green and candlelight, their hands intertwined, they did not need grand declarations or perfect words. They needed only the truth they had fought for, the truth that love, when chosen freely, could transform even cruelty into triumph. And in the heart of the Cotswolds, within the stone walls that had once held only silence, Millicent Hawthorne became at last what she had always been beneath every accusation and every punishment, a queen. Not because she wore a title, but because she was loved with honor. The year was 1828. The seasons had turned over Thornley Manor 9 times, since the day the rain washed away deceit and left only truth behind. The estate no longer stood in silence. Laughter now echoed in its halls, children's voices carried through the gardens, and the house that had once been haunted by ghosts of shame had become a sanctuary of peace. Millicent Thornley, still slender and graceful, her hair now touched with strands of gold where sunlight had kissed away the years, stood at the window of the nursery, gazing out at the orchard in bloom. Beyond the rows of apple trees, she could see the figure of her husband walking beside their eldest son, both holding small fishing rods. The boy's hair caught the same silvery light as Victor's, and his laughter, free, fearless, was a sound Millicent still cherished as proof that love could heal what lineage had once destroyed. The younger children, 2 girls and another boy, played near the pond with the nursemaid. Their gowns and breeches were muddied, their shoes abandoned, and Millicent did not scold them. She smiled instead, remembering what Thornley had been before love remade it, a prison of rules and ghosts. Now it was alive, warm, a living legacy not of nobility, but of decency. Behind her, the soft creak of the door made her turn. Victor entered quietly, his hair flecked with silver, his presence calmer now, though still carrying that deep, dignified gravity that had always set him apart. His coat was damp at the hem from the morning mist, and his hands were calloused from honest work he now chose to do, even when others expected him to live idly. He smiled when he saw her. "You still watch them, as though they might vanish," he teased gently. "I still half expect it," she admitted, her voice soft but full. "Every time I see them running there, so alive, so unburdened, I remember how easily joy can be stolen." Victor came to her side, his hand finding hers as it always had. And yet, 9 years later, it never has been. She looked up at him. His eyes, still that cool grey, still deep as memory, held the tenderness of a man who had learned not to fear love's permanence. "Because you learned to trust happiness," she said. He smiled faintly. "Because you taught me how." Outside, their eldest, William, waved toward the window. Millicent lifted her hand in return. "Do you remember," Victor said quietly, "the night you stood with me under the rain and swore the truth would survive?" "How could I forget?" she replied. "The sky was grey, and you looked as though you were ready to face the world's judgment." "And I did," he murmured, "but the world's judgment was kinder than I expected. Perhaps because I finally stopped hiding." Millicent rested her head against his shoulder. "You stopped hiding," she said, "and you started living." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "With you. The years had not been easy. There had been trials, losses, the cruel murmurs of society that took far longer to fade than any storm. But Thornley endured. The tenants flourished, the lands prospered. The manor became a model for fair work and humane treatment, an example that other estates began, slowly, grudgingly, to imitate. Change came like dawn, hesitant but certain. Lord Wycliffe did not live to see it. His fall had been quiet but devastating. The inquiry that followed the exposure of his corruption stripped him of title and property. He spent his final years abroad, exiled by disgrace, spoken of in drawing rooms as a warning rather than a name. His serpent seal was never used again. Philip Ashcombe fared little better. He fled the country soon after Wycliffe's downfall, leaving behind unpaid debts and the ruins of his reputation. Rumour had it he gambled away the last of his inheritance in Paris and vanished into obscurity. To Victor, it was not victory, but sorrow, the final reminder of a bloodline that had devoured itself. Mrs. Hawthorne lived long enough to watch the world she built collapse around her. She sold her London townhouse and retired to a cottage near Bath, where her name was spoken rarely and without affection. When a letter came years later, sealed in her familiar hand, Millicent opened it with trembling fingers. It contained no apology, only a single line. "Perhaps you were right. Survival is not the same as living." Millicent kept that letter tucked in her Bible, not out of forgiveness, but as proof that even the proudest hearts could bend under truth's weight. Now, standing beside Victor, she felt no bitterness, only gratitude for the pain that had shaped them, for the storms that had taught them how to build shelter from love rather than fear. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Mrs. Larkin, older but still upright and alert, entered with her ever-present ledger. "The tenant's accounts, my lady," she said briskly, "and the carpenter asks if you wish to see the new schoolhouse before the roof is finished." Millicent's eyes lit with warmth. The Thornley School for Workers' Children had been her dream, a promise born from her own childhood of silence and punishment. It would open in the autumn, free to every child from the neighbouring farms. "Yes," she said, "we shall go after dinner." Victor glanced at her fondly. "You have become the most formidable reformer in Gloucestershire." She laughed softly. "I only became what the world never allowed me to be before, a woman with purpose." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You were always that. The world only needed to learn to see you." As Mrs. Larkin left, Millicent turned again toward the garden. The rain had stopped, leaving drops glittering on the leaves like jewels. Their youngest daughter, Marianne, had just fallen into the mud, and instead of crying, she laughed, loud and bright, the kind of laughter that defied the solemnity of noble life. Millicent's throat tightened. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "that happiness, when it finally comes, feels almost unreal?" Victor followed her gaze to the children. "I think happiness is real only when it's shared," he said, "and ours has been." She turned to him, smiling through tears. "Then we have done something extraordinary." He took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "We have loved," he said simply, "and love, real love, survives its own storms." Later that evening, when twilight settled over Thornley, they walked together through the garden paths. The air was cool, the scent of wisteria floating like memory. Victor's arm brushed against hers, their fingers finding each other instinctively, as they always had since that first night beneath the rain. In the distance, the bells from the village church tolled softly, calling the workers home. Somewhere, a lark sang. The world, once harsh and suspicious, now felt softened by time. Millicent paused at the old fountain at the heart of the garden. Its stone rim was worn, moss growing along the base. She trailed her fingers through the water and looked up at the manor's windows glowing in the dusk. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "what Thornley will be like when we are gone?" Victor's voice was calm, steady, eternal. "If our children learn what we learned, that dignity is not inherited but chosen, then Thornley will stand long after our names fade." Millicent nodded slowly. "And if they love, then it will live," he said. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky fade to a deep lavender. Fireflies began to appear, tiny golden sparks in the darkening air. The house behind them shimmered with candlelight and distant laughter, the sound of life continuing, of generations beginning where sorrow had once ended. Victor turned to her, his hand finding her cheek. "Do you know," he murmured, "you have not changed." She smiled, amused. "I have grey hairs and lines on my hands, and I love them," he said softly. "They are the map of every year you have given me." She reached up, tracing the faint scar at his temple from some long-ago fall on the moor. "And this is the mark of every year you have survived me." They laughed quietly together, the sound like home. As night settled fully, they began to walk back toward the manor. Behind them, the fountain murmured, the trees whispered, and somewhere in the distance, their children's laughter echoed across the fields, a reminder that love, once sown in courage, could bloom endlessly. And so Thornley endured, no longer a house of punishment or pride, but a living testament to two souls who had chosen truth over fear, mercy over vengeance, and love over ruin. For in the end, Victor and Millicent Thornley did not conquer the world. They transformed it, one act of grace, one heartbeat at a time. Every love story teaches us something about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. The Marquis and his beggar wife reminds us that love is not born from wealth, status, or convenience, but from the willingness to see another soul as worthy, even when the world refuses to. Millicent and Victor showed us that redemption is not found in power, but in tenderness, that the heart, once open to truth, can rebuild what pride once destroyed, and that even after storms of shame, betrayal, and loss, love, honest, steady, and humble, can still rise from the ashes and bloom again. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect on what you've just heard. What did you feel when you saw two people choosing love over fear? What would you fight for if your dignity were tested? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this story now. And if you've stayed with us until this very moment, write the word Thornley in the comments below. It will be our secret symbol, a mark of those who believe, like Millicent and Victor, that love can outlast the storm. If you wish to support the team who brings these timeless romances to life, you can send us super thanks on YouTube, any amount you wish. Your kindness helps us continue creating stories filled with hope, passion, and beauty. And if you can't support us that way, sharing this video with someone who loves period dramas is another wonderful gift that means the world to us. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing in love that stands the test of time. Don't forget to explore the other historical romances waiting for you in the cards, each one crafted with the same heart, emotion, and timeless devotion. Because in the end, as Victor and Millicent taught us, the truest victories are not written in titles or fortunes, but in hearts that choose to love again and again.